Have you ever had a need to parse some JSON that the parse JSON action in your flow just couldn't handle? Today we're going to look at a way that you can do that by using JavaScript in Azure Logic Apps and using an action that's unique to Logic Apps, which is called execute JavaScript code. It actually lets you execute a small snippet of code within your flow, and it can accept dynamic content into that JavaScript, and then you can get the output back out of that action to do other things downstream. I'm going to show you the use case that I had for this, and we're going to tap into some AI by using Copilot to help us write some JavaScript to do some manipulation to some JSON to make it parsable. By the way, I'm testing out a new format for my videos. I'm going to move a lot faster. For things that require a really long form video, I'm still going to make those. But I'm making the assumption that if you're watching a video about JavaScript and parsing JSON and using Logic Apps and Copilot, that you have some familiarity with these concepts. So I'm not going to go as in-depth as I have been in the past, because it seems like, based on the stats, everybody that's watching my videos really likes a shorter format. This is the Logic Apps Designer. I'm going to just create a compose action in here. Well, now I can't show you the real example of this because it was for a customer's proof of concept. It was a problem that they were having, and so we're going to use this one instead. So as you can see here, we have a JSON object, not an array, with two nested objects inside where their keys are GUIDs. And these keys, they change. Every time they receive this payload, the key has changed. And so if I tried to do a parse JSON here, and I upload a sample payload here and I use that same JSON object, what I'm going to see in here is that the schema that it reads has really static properties in terms of the key value pairs. So it thinks that it's going to expect this GUID to always be the key of these nested objects. And like I just said, that's not what we were receiving in the payload. So the problem is that if I try to run this parse JSON against their payload, it's going to fail validation every single time. And that's just because the schema is dynamic. So how do we solve that problem? Well, we can use Inline Code, and we can use JavaScript along with Regex to identify those GUID values and replace them with something else. So the idea here is I'm going to store the JSON payload in this compose action. The next thing I'm going to do is create a new step. I'm going to pick the inline code action. So in order to use this, you need to have an integration account established and set up with this Logic app. So I'm not going to go through how to do that. All the documentation is available on Microsoft's website. You can go check that out. In fact, I'll put a link up here for you. But I've already done that here. So when I put this in, it says, here's some sample code, whatever, right? Hello world from, and then it gives us the name of the Logic app. So in this case, js-regex-copilot. Cool. I don't want that. And delete it. So we need our own code. Well, I know just from my experience in working with Regex that it can find matches for certain types of strings. And I'm going to just treat my JSON as a string in this case. You can do that. There's no law against that. So I'm going to take my compose action here. We're going to assume that it's going to understand that this is JSON, but I'm going to treat it as a string. Okay? So what I probably would do in this case is I would have my compose action here. Let's rename this original JSON. And then what I'm going to do below that is do another compose. I'm going to pick the outputs of my original JSON, but I'm not going to do it that way. I'm going to express them as a string. So I'm going to write the word string and then pick my outputs from original JSON. I'm going to stick that in, and I'll just call this one string JSON. So now we need code, right? Well, how are we going to get that? I don't know how to just smash out some JavaScript for Regex, so I'm going to go over to VS Code and I'm going to ask it to help me create some JavaScript to do Regex against this string. So let's go over to VS Code. All right, so here we are on VS Code. I have the Copilot extension installed, If you don't know about Copilot, go check out my other video. There's going to be a link up top of your screen somewhere to take you to that one. It'll teach you how to use it, how it compares to ChatGPT and some other stuff. But basically the way it works is if you install it in your favorite IDE, then you can just put code comments in and it will go and search for code that it thinks might work for you. So what I'm going to do here, I have a new JavaScript file open. You can see that in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. I'm going to put in a code comment and I'm going to ask it for regex to replace all GUID values in a string with a new string called key string. I'm going to hit Control Enter and I'm going to let it try to synthesize something for me. Okay, so it gave me some possibilities here, and these actually look pretty good. Not going to tell you that, you know, I got this on the first try, because I didn't. I had to go through and figure out, you know, how to make this work properly. So I hit accept on this, and it brought in all of this junk, but we really only need the first one. So I started going through this to see if I could figure out what it was doing here. I'm going to delete my original prompt as well. So if I look through here, I have a bunch of variables. And the first one's called keystring, and it has this word new key. Well, I didn't want new key, but I mean, I could use that. Basically, I can put anything I want in here. So when I want to replace those GUID values in our JSON, whatever I put in here in the keystring variable can replace those dynamic GUIDs. So I'll leave new key, actually. Let's see if we can get it to work with just new key. So this next line, var regex, is a variable that holds the actual regex expression that's going to be used when this script looks through our string to try to find matches. And you can see at the end here we have gi/gi. So this means global G, and then I is a case insensitivity, I think. So basically it's just going to ignore casing. Then we have var str. Now this is going to be our string value. So this is going to be the JSON string in our flow, and we're going to have to replace this string with the outputs of our compose, where we expressed our JSON object as a string. Below that we have var new str, so new string. This one takes the str and it does a dot replace on that. It replaces anything that matches the regex with our new key string, and then it logs it to the console. So if we wanted to test this in VS Code, we could do that just by going up to run and hit run without debugging. But you can see down here in the debug console, we started with this string and we ended up with this one where we have a GUID new key in place of the original GUID value. So we know that this works. Now, how do we make this work for our use case? Well, let's go back over to Power Automate and play with this a little bit. So I've copied the code that Copilot came up with, and I'm going to bring it over here to the Logic Apps Designer, and in my code section for execute JavaScript code, this action, I'm going to paste it in. Now, I'm going to kind of clean it up a little bit for it. First and foremost, console.log is just going to spit out whatever it is you're asking it to write to the log. So in our case, we're writing new string to the log. New string is going to be our string variable with any GUIDs replaced. That's great, that's what we want, but the console.log doesn't actually give us what we need to get things out of this action. So if you go and you add another one of these actions, you remember earlier I deleted what was in there because I didn't need it. Turns out there's a little hint in there. So we go here to Inline Code, execute JavaScript. Right here on line 3, we have return text. Let's go down to our original action, and instead of our console.log, let's say return, and then this time, let's do new str. And you can see that it's actually auto-suggesting that for us, which is pretty cool. It realizes that that's a variable within our code, and so it's like, hey, maybe this is what you want. It is. So we're going to return new string. So at this point, we could go ahead and test this just to see if the execute JavaScript code is actually working the way that we wanted. But in order to do that, we need to come down and add one more step. So we'll add another compose action. And in this one, we will get the result out. So you can see result becomes dynamic content from our previous action, our inline code action. We'll put the result in there. So what I'm expecting to see here is this string, but with new key in place of any GUID values that are in there. And in our case, it's just this one. So let's go ahead and save the Logic app. Remember, you've got to have an integration account attached to your Logic app before you come in and start building this, and that's done in the workflow settings. Go check the docs for more information on that. So let's go ahead and run our trigger. Okay, it says successfully check the trigger, and there we go. We had it run, and so now you can see down here, this is a string with a GUID new key in it. So that GUID value that was there before is no longer there, and if you remember, if we look back, that's exactly the same result that we got in our debug console when we ran this JavaScript in VS Code. So we know that things are working the way that we would want them to work. But the problem is we don't care about this string, we care about our JSON so that we can make it parsable. So let's go back in here to the designer. Okay, so we need to replace var str, the static string that's in here in our test. We need to replace that with our dynamic content. And our dynamic content needs to be the string JSON representation of the JSON payload that we're trying to work with. So what's cool about this is that you can just cut this out, and then you can just pick that dynamic content. And it's going to put that in there for you. Boom, there you go. And actually, if you look at this closely, there's a lot of different things you can do with this. If you remember, when we originally loaded the execute JavaScript code action, there was some test code in there, and it actually used this workflow context as well, but it used it at the workflow level. So it said workflow context.workflow.name, which gave us the name of the Logic app workflow. In this case, we're trying to dig into the actions, specifically the string JSON action, and the property we're trying to get from it is the outputs. But it's very easy to just put your cursor where you need it to be in your code and then click the dynamic content over here on the right, and it will stick that in there for you. Let's go ahead and run this again. Okay, and as you can see, we now have a new string, and it is our JSON, but we no longer have the GUID keys. Right? We have new key instead, which is exactly what we were trying to achieve. However, I've been playing a nasty little trick on you because this is still not parsable. What we have is two objects with two different schemas, both with the same name. And parse JSON does not like that, it turns out. It detects duplicate objects, and it will only parse the first one that it hits when you try to upload a sample payload. So what we just saw there, where we had our replaced GUID values with new key, it doesn't work. It will only give you back the schema for the first object with that name that it encounters. So we need to make some modifications to our JavaScript code. So what we can do here is we can say, actually, we want two key strings. We'll have var keystring 2, and that will be new key 2. So now we have another key string that we can pass in. And the really interesting thing here is, if you remember on our regex, we talked about global. Global, what it does is it matches all the cases and it replaces them. So what we can do there is we can say, actually, we just want to replace one. Okay, so what that's going to do when we invoke this .replace function down here is it's just going to replace the first GUID that it encounters with new key. The second GUID will stay a GUID until we do something with it. So what I'm going to do here is say, now I want var new str to be new str.replace. Still going to use regex, but this time we want to use keystring 2. So because we've told it we're not doing global here, and we've got another .replace function happening, this time against the output of the previous replace action, what we should see here is the first object showing up as new key, and the second object is going to show up as new key 2. And then finally, we're going to return new str, which is our final output that we're hoping to get. So let's run that and see what happens. Okay, so now if we hit show raw outputs, you see our new key here. And again, all these slashes and things that you see, this is because it still thinks this is a string, and technically it is. But we have new key with the created to column, description to, name to, and then we have new key 2 with created, deleted, yada, 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 yada. You get the idea. So now that we've done all that, we can finally get to parsing the JSON. So I'm going to go ahead and do a new parse JSON action. Now I can actually get rid of this compose now because I know that what I'm getting out of my execute JavaScript code action is what I want. So I'm going to delete that. Remember, it still thinks that our JSON is a string, so we need to tell it that it isn't by invoking the JSON function here against our results. For the schema, I'm going to use what I've got in my clipboard. So we have new key and new key 2. That's what our script is producing. I'm going to hit done. And so now we can see we have type object with these properties. We have new key and new key 2 with individual columns for each one, right? Or individual properties for each one. So if we do a compose after that, we can get access to everything now. We can pull out the name value if we want to, which will come out of, I believe, new key 2. We could pull out type 2, which would come out of, I believe, new key 1. And we can actually validate that by just clicking one of these and hovering over it. You can't see it on your screen, but that tells me that type 2 comes out of new key. What's cool there too is that since we didn't make this into an array in order to reference it that way, it's an object, we can just directly reference these columns and it'll pull off straight out of where it needs to come from. The other thing you can do is if you wanted to grab the object as a whole, you could say, give me new key, and then that would just pull just the new key set of properties out for you and express those as JSON for you to see. Why don't we just pick one here? I think description 2 should come back as test. So if we pick description 2, we save our Logic app, and then we run it, our final output there should be test, and there it is. All right, that's it for this one. So, things we learned. You can run JavaScript in Logic Apps. Copilot can help you write JavaScript, but you may have to get clever and add to it later. And seemingly imparsable, is that a word? Non-parsable JSON can actually be parsed if you're clever enough to figure out how to do it. But now you know. So, tell your friends or whatever. Thanks for watching.